So, welcome to the Colloquium. It's a pleasure for me to introduce to you Jacob Vigdor. Jake received his PhD in economics from Harvard University in 1999 and is currently professor of public policy and governance at the University of Washington. He also holds affiliations as a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, and a External Fellow at the Center for Research and Analysis of Migration at University College London. Jake's work crosses a wide range of social policy areas, including education and inequality, immigration, immigrant assimilation, housing policies and segregation, as well as issues of racial and ethnic economic inequality. He has been twice awarded the Raymond Vermont Memorial Prize for Best Article published in the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. He has received many awards. His work has also appeared in the Journal of Political Economy, American Economic Journal, Journal of Human Resources, and many more. Just this year, Jake was selected by Education Week as among the top 10 most influential economists in the US today. Jake and our families go way back. We started at Duke together as an assistant professor at the same time. We had children at the same time. I didn't make it to the top 10 sociologists, but maybe I'm running out of time. But anyway, so help me introduce to you Jake.
Emilio didn't mention exactly how precise that timing was. So my wife and I show up to the maternity ward, and they're there. So it was really close timing. Well, it's great. It's great to be back here on the Penn campus. I was asked this morning, is this your first time here? And I had to say I've lost track of how many times I've been here. So I want to talk to you today about this project, and I'll give you a little bit of the history of how I got here. I've been at the University of Washington. This is my 10th year there, and for my first few years, I did a lot of work on studying the minimum wage in Seattle. And this ended up being kind of a politically controversial study. We had some funding from the city of Seattle, but the city of Seattle thought that they were contracting on results, and we thought that we were contracting on methods. And so, that led to some frictions there. But this was a study that was conducted very much in the public eye, and I got a lot of requests from labor groups, from business groups, from reporters about what's going on with the workforce in Seattle. And those requests have continued, even though the minimum wage study is now kind of published. And I think that writing one minimum wage paper is sort of the maximum that any sane person should do in their career. And so I'm perfectly happy to move on. I still get a lot of requests, and what's happening in the labor market in Seattle, the story that I would have told back in 2017 or 2018 is that the minimum wage seems to be doing very good things for people who already have jobs, but it's going to make it more difficult for teenagers to find their first job, because what we were hearing across the board and what we were seeing in data is employers were very happy to pay higher wages to workers with experience. But they were reducing their rate of hiring newcomers to the workforce. And then these kids that I was having back when I was hanging out with Emilio and Cheno at Duke, they grew up and they got jobs, and they got jobs so fast. I had two kids that applied for one job each, and I tried to tell them, this is not, when you're looking for your first job, you don't do that. But then they both got the one job they applied for. And so then I realized, okay, this is not the story that I was telling. Something different is happening here. And then this story that was initially a Seattle story started being more of a national story, because you started seeing, okay, there are these shortages of labor. It's getting hard to hire a dishwasher almost anywhere. And you see the wages for these jobs going up. And I was getting these calls from Chamber of Commerce and from reporters. Explain to us what's going on. And so the explanations that I was just sort of coming up with on the fly to explain what was going on sort of turned into this paper. And so the phenomenon that I'm really kind of motivated by is something that I first learned about as a graduate student when the data series sort of stopped here. And the story that I learned as a graduate student is that income inequality in the United States has been rising. And so you can see that the rise here, this is all using current population survey, March CPS data, using the same methods that were used by June, Murphy, and Pierce in the Journal of Political Economy, 1993, just extending the time series. So June, Murphy, and Pierce would have showed you the first 20 or 30 years of this data, the rise in inequality. It shows up whether you're looking at annual wages or weekly wages, which is just sort of annual income divided by weeks worked. There continues to be kind of like a continued rise. If you want to look for where is the maximum on these time series, it depends on which measure you're looking at, but it's sometime in, sometime between 2010, 2015, in that area. And then depending on how you squint at the data since then, either you might tell the story that inequality is kind of stabilized, or you might tell the story that it's actually trending downwards a little bit at least. And so we had inequality that was rising. We had inequality that sort of looked like it had reached some kind of plateau. And then maybe, we have to sort of let the data play out to see how much of a long run trend this is. But certainly if you sort of are following what's being written in the press and the popular press and all this sort of stuff, there are still these shortages. There are still, the minimum wage right now is $18.69 in Seattle. And, and there's very few businesses that are advertising openings for anything less than 20. And that's just how hard it is to find workers who are willing to take these positions at the low end of the labor force. And if you look at what's been written by some of the other labor economists like David Autor and co-authors, they are seeing that there's this wage growth at the bottom end of the distribution that is not apparent at other points in the distribution. And so, okay, so there's a variety of stories that have been told over the past few decades to help us understand. So as long as there has been an increase in income inequality in the data, there have been efforts to explain why it's happening. And these explanations have largely focused on what I would call the demand side of the market. It's just that what's happening, the thing that was really difficult for low-income workers, one thing is what we call skill-biased technological change. So it's a hypothesis that goes back to the early 90s, and the basic idea is, okay, automation has taken what used to be a lot of fairly well-paid jobs that you didn't need a lot of skill for, like an assembly line production plant or something like that. You had those jobs, and some of those jobs were automated, and some of those jobs were sent overseas. So you see those two explanations there: skill-biased technological change. That is, we now have robots to perform the tasks on assembly lines that humans once did. And we'll see some evidence that the demand side. I'm not going to tell you today that the demand side theory is wrong. I just think that what I'm going to argue to you is that it's not the complete story. International trade, there's also some strong evidence that as we have sent certain types of manufacturing jobs abroad, the communities that used to host those industries have now seen a decline in the economic fortunes, particularly of sort of less educated workers. Another story that people like to tell about the minimum wage is more of an institutional story, that over the period of time where inequality rose, unionization was declining, the real value of the minimum wage was declining. And there's a real debate. I mean, so the debate in the literature has really been between like the demand side camp and the institutional camp. The supply side is sort of nowhere to be seen. And so the most recent work trying to understand what's going on with this decline in inequality in the most recent data, the hypothesis that's being advanced is more of a market structure hypothesis that, okay, that wages in some sectors are being held down because of monopsony power by firms, and maybe that's declining. Okay. So the talk today is going to be really focused on the supply side, and I'm going to take you through this. The argument that I'm going to make today is hundreds of years old, and I'd say it was very prominent in the literature on what's going on with the distribution of earnings in the labor market until sometime in the 1980s or the early 1990s. When it just completely fell off the radar, and it was considered a refuted hypothesis, and people know even to this day it's not very widely considered. But I'm going to show you some data that suggests that maybe this really should be part of the conversation. And so the story that I'm going to tell is, it ends up being a story that's largely about the baby boom, and the rise in inequality sort of coincides with the entry of the baby boom into the labor market. And this decline that we're seeing in the most recent data coincides with the exit of the baby boom via retirement. Immigration is also part of the story as well. Immigration was very rapid between about 1980 and 2008. It has slowed. And so this is where the demographics come in. So if you think about the low-wage workforce has historically involved a lot of young workers and a lot of immigrants. Well, the aging of the population implies that young workers are now a smaller share of the total population than they have been previously. And with low immigration, that's another decline in the supply side as well. And so if you just look at demographic projections for the United States, you know, the prediction that I would make on the basis of this is that what we're seeing now could very well be the beginning of a sustained trend towards lower inequality, because the population is going to continue aging. We're seeing birth rates continue to decline, not only in the United States, but all over the world, which means, okay, we're going to have smaller cohorts of younger workers born here in the United States. And if we look around to try to find immigrants, there are going to be fewer of them, because all over the world, not just in developed countries, but at basically all income levels of GDP per capita, we see this. So that's kind of the talk in a nutshell. And now I'll take you through the data.
Yeah, just real quick. I love we set up. The question I have is, the labor shortage seems to me to potentially increase wages all across the board. You're focused on it, right? Increasing wages at the bottom.
Yeah.
And I'm not quite sure I was following why.
That's going to be an important part of the story. So the way that I would rephrase that is, okay, if all of a sudden, what I'm going to tell you is that we reached a historic peak. It's this graph here, as a matter of fact. We reached this historic peak somewhere around 10 to 15 years ago, in the percent of the population in the United States that was of working age. And I'm just sort of defining, this is a very broad definition of working age, 18 to 65. Okay. So the number of people who are potential workers as a share of the population reaches an all-time high. Okay, so then the question becomes, well, doesn't this mean that, my argument is going to be, okay, when you have a lot of people looking for work, and especially in a service-driven economy, the demand for the services is going to be driven by the size of the population. So if we have a fixed population size and there are more people offering to do the service for you, it's going to lead to natural pressure for the wage to decline. And the question is, well, shouldn't this work for doctors as much as it does for fast food workers? Okay. And so part of the story is going to be that, well, the doctors figured out how to create a labor market institution that restricts the supply of doctors. And the fast food workers of the world, and actually, the economic model of unions, and we're going to see that the number one occupation for college-educated workers is typically school teachers, who are very often unionized. So one of the ways that unions operate is to say, okay, we want to restrict the size of the workforce in this occupation to protect the earnings potential of the members of this occupation. And at the very low end of the wage distribution, you don't see the same kinds of protective institutions, although they are now starting to become, with Starbucks workers unionizing and that sort of thing, it's becoming more prominent. Okay, so rise in inequality sort of coincides with this rising share of the population that is of working age, and then this recent decline kind of coincides with this recent decline. And this, this is going to, if you look at census projections, by the time we get to about 2060, we're going to be back around where we were around 1970, 1980, in terms of the percent of the population that is working age. These are the two things that I'm going to try to knit together for you. I will tell you that the working age population, I'm going to focus on, instead of asking, okay, what's the employment to population ratio, what is labor force participation look like, I'm going to focus on working age population. Historically speaking, it's an extremely strong predictor of the actual labor force size. But this is sort of saying, okay, people's decisions about whether to actually be in the labor force, conditional on being of working age, I'm going to kind of take one step back from that labor force participation and just focus at this level, but these two things are extremely highly correlated. Okay, so the demographics here, the aging of the population is really a big part of the story. So historically speaking, you go back 50 years, and the United States was a country where we would have somewhere between 3.5, 4 million 18-year-olds in any given year, and the number of 65-year-olds was somewhere around half that. And in the most recent data, I looked at this data, the most recent year I have here is 2022, and I thought to myself, oh boy, by 2023, these lines might actually cross, which would be a historic moment. I just looked at the 2023 data, I think 2 days ago, and it turns out that this gold line here is a little bit of a blip, so it goes back down again. So the lines haven't quite crossed yet, but nonetheless, we are now living in a society where the number of 65-year-olds approximately equals the number of 18-year-olds, and that is, the 18-year-olds are, when we think about who is going to take a lot of these lowest paying jobs, that's a big component of that workforce, and they're just shrinking as a share of the overall population. Okay, so my story is kind of focused on the supply side, and one of the arguments I'm going to make is that the supply side can help us to understand what's been going on in the most recent years of data. And one of the things I'm going to argue is that some of these other kind of institutional or demand side stories actually struggle a little bit more, because basically if you were going to tell the story that the increase in inequality is due to declining unionization, well, unionization has sort of continued to decline over the past few years. If you want to look at the role of technological change, well, I don't know quite how to measure technological change, but how about patents? Well, there's still plenty of patents going on in the past few years. I mean, there's a little bit of a decline right after the pandemic, but it's not as though technological change suddenly ceased 10 years ago. And then trade, there's definitely a rise. So this graph here goes back to 1950. So you can see that, yes, the rise in inequality does coincide with the rise in international trade, but and trade is maybe stabilized as a percent of GDP, but it's not as though that the past few years have seen a dramatic reduction. Okay, so the argument that I'm making, you can sort of trace the kind of intellectual origins of this back to folks like Adam Smith and Malthus and Ricardo. And the basic idea is that at some point, if the population gets too big, you exhaust some resource. And I'm not here to tell you that we're all going to starve. So Malthus thought we were going to run out of food. Well, we somehow managed to figure out technological improvements in food production. Ricardo thought that we would run out of capital. And I think that somehow we've managed to keep up capital with the size of the workforce. But my argument is going to be slightly different, and it's that, okay, particularly when we have a service-based economy, the number of workers, the demand for work is going to be largely determined by population size. And so holding population size fixed, as the number of people who are looking to serve that population increases, the returns to serving that population should diminish. That's just sort of a basic economic theory argument of diminishing returns. As we already talked about, this does not necessarily imply growing inequality, but it's the other thing that I'm going to bring in here is kind of an institutional story, which is to say, okay, you can insulate your occupation from this effect if you have some mechanism to restrict entry into your occupation. And so which occupations have had this capacity to restrict entry? It's been more common at the high end of the historical earnings distribution and not so much as the low end. Okay. So these supply side stories, as I mentioned, you can read 200 years of social science and you'll see plenty of references to them. But one of the things I'm going to talk about sort of right off the bat is why did we change our minds? So why did social science and labor economics in particular move away from the notion that, okay, these movements in the composition of the population have a determinative role in inequality? And I'm going to point to a couple of early 1990s entries into this literature. David Card's Mariel Boatlift paper. Okay, so I'm going to take a recent Nobel laureate and say that this work was maybe not the right way to think about the problem. And then there's another paper by Katz and Murphy looking at, and so basically this argument here was, well, the Mariel boat lift brought a lot of immigrants to the Miami labor market, and wages in Miami didn't really decline, so maybe the size of your labor supply doesn't really matter that much for determining wages after all. Katz and Murphy are looking kind of longitudinally and saying, okay, if we sort of track time from the 1970s to the 1980s, we see that the cohort of young, less educated workers gets a lot smaller coming out of the baby boom generation and the baby bust generation. So although this demographic group got a lot smaller, their wages really declined. And so if we thought that labor supply was determinative for this demographic group, the fact that there are fewer of them, it should lead their wages to go up. And so this was and so I'm going to basically make some counter arguments here that it's not necessarily the best way of thinking about the problem. If you look more recently, you know, when people talk about labor supply over the past 10 years, one of the things you hear most often is that, well, the big problem is that our labor force doesn't have enough college graduates. That the main thing going on, the main problem with supply is that, you know, we had a lot of growth in the percent of the population that was graduating from college, but that's kind of stagnated. And if we could just get more people degrees, then that would do something about inequality. What I'm going to show you is that I'm going to show you evidence that sort of indicates that although we may not be keeping up that trend and producing more college graduates, we do see college graduates piling up in some occupations where historically you never saw college graduates, which I think is potentially inconsistent with the notion that we have a shortage of them overall. Okay, so the data that I'm going to show you and the results I'm going to show you, I'm going to summarize them here, and I'm going to begin with this caveat, which is that I'm writing a paper that is very out of style for modern economics, because modern economics relies on randomized trials or instrumental variables or regression discontinuity or some sort of clever trick of, you know, kind of very carefully establishing one regression coefficient. And so this is like the card strategy with the Mariel boat lift. It's this exogenous shock to the Miami area. So let's compare what goes on in Miami to places like Atlanta and Tampa that didn't experience the same shock. So it's kind of, I'm not even going to make an attempt to do anything like that. This is, so when I talk about the percent of the population that is of working age, that's not a variable that's really subject to these sudden shocks. It varies very smoothly. And also, you know, the techniques of modern economics are really best suited for situations where you're looking for a cause-effect relationship that happens instantaneously. So we see something, we see an impulse at time t, and we see the response at time t, and we can really make that careful attribution. And part of what I'm going to say here is that I'm not exactly sure that we can make the same argument, that the impact should be seen instantaneously. So bear that in mind as we talk about everything today. But I'm going to show you some evidence that, okay, the Mariel boat lift was maybe not that big an intervention into the size of the labor supply, the workforce in regards to the population. And so the card natural experiment is not necessarily a natural experiment on the variable that I'm talking about. To explain why things were so bad for young, less educated workers in the 1980s, I'm going to show you that there were a lot of new labor force entrants who were not young in the 1980s who may have been competing with these workers. And so looking at that demographic group in isolation doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. And then I'm going to show you some really kind of basic ordinary least squares regression. And I'm going to tell you that, you know, the percent of the population that is of working age, looking at time series data or looking also at panel data, looking across states in the US, is a pretty consistent predictor of inequality. And the occupation information that I mentioned. So, you know, the traditional, while the high skill occupations have expanded, the number of college graduates has actually expanded much more rapidly. And college grads are now an increasing share of in occupation like farm labor and restaurant wait staff. Okay, So that's now you kind of know everything that you're going to see in this talk. So let me just walk you through it. Mariel boat lift is the first thing to talk about, because the Mariel boat lift, I end up talking, when I have casual conversations about this work with people, this is something we go back to, because you want to think back to, well, can you get something that looks like experimental evidence to support your hypothesis? And this is potentially a quasi-experiment that would seem to refute the hypothesis. I should say that the evidence based on the Mariel boat lift is there's still papers being written about it, and it's controversial, and authors go back and forth about what are the conclusions here. But I just want to show you this evidence that's taken from the current population survey, because this is where we get annual data that is at least somewhat reliable. The Mariel boat lift starts, this is the population estimate for the Miami metro area that is taken from the March CPS of 1980. The Mariel boat lift begins in April of 1980. It is largely finished by March of 1981. So you can see, if you just sort of trace what was happening with the Miami area population, it was somewhere around 1.5-ish million people up to this point in time. And it jumps by about 120,000 in 1 year. And 120,000 is approximately what estimates of the size of the Mariel boat lift are. But what I want to focus your attention on is this notion that, okay, this was, an increase of 120,000, so not quite a 10% increase in population. The change in the percent of the population that was of working age is actually, it's just 2 percentage points. And actually, if you compare 1980 to 1979, there's more movement, or even if you compare 1979 to 1978, this doesn't look like a giant leap compared to sort of ordinary time series data for one metro area. And of course, these are estimates based on a sample in the CPS, so they're all subject to sampling error. So it's not necessarily a really gigantic impulse there. If you look at the percent of the population in the labor force, that actually, there's no change. So, you can debate what the impact of the Mariel boat lift was, but one possibility for why the Mariel boat lift did not necessarily have a large impact on wages in Miami is that it brought people looking for work, but it also brought people who were not looking for work. Not every Marielito was a working age person. Okay, so that's how I look back on that evidence. Let me next sort of talk to you about this Katz and Murphy result that was also very influential, because the Katz and Murphy evidence ends up being cited the next year in June, Murphy, and Pierce, and so basically this is the evidence that helped economics reach the conclusion that the baby boom was irrelevant. Okay. But I'm going to show you a birth cohort here, and it's a very special birth cohort. These are people born in approximately 1947, and that's my parents. And so this is, and I can tell you a little story that's kind of personalized. I'm born in 1972, and my mom was in the workforce up until 1972, and then left. And so this is her. This little downtick in the number of people born in 1947 in the who are in the labor force, okay, that's maybe a few thousand people that we're talking about, but so this is one reason why you might see a decrease. The peak in terms of the number of 1947 birth cohort people in the workforce occurs not until like the late 1980s. And so Katz and Murphy are looking at data for approximately this point in time and saying, okay, when we're looking for new labor market entrants, we need to be looking for young people. That is, people born quite a bit later than 1947. Because by this point in time, these folks are about 40. And so what we see is that, okay, relative to, say, 1972, when this birth cohort was approximately 25, there's actually a significant, what does the slide say? It's about a quarter of 40-year-olds in the workforce in 1987 were not in the workforce in the early 1970s. Some of this is immigration, but some of this is, you can tell the story of my mom again. So my mom went back into the labor force in the mid-1980s. It's not an unusual story for in her generation for a woman to leave the workforce when kids are young and re-enter the workforce when the kids go to school. Common story. So I think that when we think about the economic fortunes of the young, less educated workers of the mid-1980s, it's not as though they got a segment of the labor force or a segment of the economy all to themselves. They are competing with people in other demographic categories, and many of them older workers who are themselves relatively new to the labor force. Okay, so next piece of evidence to talk to you about is occupation information. So I'm going to show you, I went to the CPS for 1968, and I asked the question, if I see someone with no more than a high school education, what's their occupation? And so I have 10 on this graph, and if you tally up, this comes close to representing about 40 to 50% of all less educated workers in 1968 were in one of these 10 occupations. And so the top one on the list is farm laborer. Then you've got laborers outside construction, machine operators, childcare workers, etc. And you can see that most of these occupations are really dominated by less educated workers, with the exception, there are some here, so secretaries, it's only 71% workers with no more than a high school education. General office clerks, salespersons, but you look at farm labor, labor outside construction, machine operator, childcare worker, as of 1968, those are overwhelmingly occupations that are dominated by less educated workers. And so the demand side story here would be that, okay, some of these occupations just kind of have disappeared. And I think it's the very next slide, I'm going to show you that it's really true. If we look at machine operators, as of 1968, there were approximately 6 million people working as machine operators. And in 2022, that's down to 1.4 million. So the demand side story of what's going on is about, all right, there's these jobs that were employing relatively less educated workers that just kind of go away. So that seems to be the story of machine operator, but it's not universally the story here. And so, childcare worker, we had 1.4 million in 1968, and we have 1.1 million as of 2022. And of course, we all know that there's this giant shortage of childcare workers. So I think that, there's probably, this is a number that's being restrained not so much by demand, but by supply these days. There's, 1.6 million of them as of 2004. So childcare worker is not a job that gets automated out of existence. Okay. But one of the things that you see happening, this is something that I referred to earlier, in 1968, it's less than 1% of childcare workers who are college educated. And now it's about 1 out of every 6 childcare workers actually has a 4-year degree. And so this has historically been a less educated occupation. It's become a more educated occupation. Yes? Yes, no, that's true. So a lot of these childcare workers are very young. And so you see that they are getting older. And actually, it's not the only occupation here. Some of the farm labor information is obscured there by our little zoom window there. But you can see at least that, that the median age of farm laborers is also trending upwards. And, we went from less than 1% of farm laborers being college educated to now about a 10th of them. I've got the other less educated occupations here. And so it's a mixed story. There are definitely some occupations here that follow the pattern of, okay, these jobs were automated or the jobs went overseas. But there are also, so the percent of secretaries with a college degree went from 6% to 30%. The percent of wait staff with a college degree went from 1.6 to 10%. Personal services not elsewhere classified, 1.8% to 18%. So if this were a story that the labor market was sort of snatching up all these college-educated workers to do work that could not be done by any kind of worker, we wouldn't necessarily expect to see this pattern.
But including
I mean, I don't know where you're going with this. I see the point that this occupation is still there, but if you just by size of the labor force, we're going to get different. In 1960% of the labor force that was.
Yeah. So okay, like the labor force is growing. So the population of the United States overall pretty close to doubles over this time period. So to keep up as a share of the labor force, these numbers. So when I see that, okay, the number of wait staff, 1.5 to 1.9, that is some absolute growth, but as a share of the overall labor force, that has declined. I mean, it's not as sharp as a decline as the machine operators. And another thing about wait staff is that, so there are certain of these jobs where you can say, okay, well, the job of secretary, you now need more training for that because it's a different kind of job than it used to be, because it's more likely to involve computers and all this sort of stuff. The amount of technological change for restaurant wait staff, that job probably has not changed very much since 1968. And so like when we see this increase, so yeah, as a share of the overall workforce, this is smaller. But part of my story is it's hard to tell the story of why we now have 10% of restaurant wait staff with a college degree that relates to technological change. So I don't think that the job now has higher skill requirements. I don't. So the CPS doesn't have that kind of detailed information. American Community Survey, I'm going to plan to expand this work by looking at the ACS to some extent. That will at least tell me what someone majored in. And so I think, the story that people tell about the lack of college-educated workers, I don't know that, a lot of it is very STEM field focused. And so, we need more engineers, we need more computer scientists, that sort of thing. If you look at what's at the list of what majors are the fastest growing, so if you look at the ACS data to try to figure out what major has grown the most over decades, I did this recently, the answer is communications. And so is communications a field where we have much stronger demand than we did, or is it some of the communications majors that are discovering that with their credential that they can't go be an engineer, maybe they have to get some other type of occupation?
Yeah, so one issue is that in this data, or at least from what you've shown, it's true that waiters and waitresses are probably not more skilled than in the past, but the age is very low. And the ones where the age is increased, they do seem to be a little bit more skilled. So machine operation is almost like a really different career now than it was in 1968. And that's also true, as you mentioned, with secretary, to some extent salesperson. Some of these people need to be able to use Salesforce, fairly advanced tools. I would be very curious if you look at the skill level and the skills that are used on the job. There's a question on this in the LSY that you could look at that looks at computer non-routine skills. And I suspect that it's gone up for some of these things. Waiter waitress, I think you're totally right. But this to me looks like a transition, something you're doing because it takes now a while to get to those jobs.
Sure. Yeah. No, I can totally do that. Thanks for the tip about NLSY. I'll take a look at that. Okay. My instructions are to finish up by 12:45. So let me just run you through. I just have a few more slides left here. Let's look at the high end real quick. So I showed you what less educated workers did in 1968. Here's what the college degree recipients were doing in 1968. About 1 out of 5 was a primary or secondary school teacher. About another 1 out of 5 was a manager or administrator, which is kind of a broad job category, but it combines a lot of other things. Then you've got your doctors, your lawyers, your salespersons, you've got accountants, you've got clergy, electrical engineers, and musicians and composers. I feel like this is now Jeopardy or something. Our categories today. So, and of course, there's a mix here. So your primary and secondary school teachers and your physicians, overwhelmingly college educated. And then you've got some of these other occupations that are very common, but not very many of those workers actually had a college degree. And it's just the fact that they were so common that they become common for the college educated. And now what I want to show you next is that, okay, if we see what happened to these occupations over time, so they have grown. And so like the number of college-educated workers. Okay, so this is, let me see if I can sort of not hide the punchline quite so much. Okay, and let's move it. There we go. And then maybe I can even hide this. Hide floating media. There we go. Perfect. Okay. So now, the college-educated, the experienced college-educated workforce since 1968 has expanded not quite by a factor of 10, but nearly that much. And so then the question is, all right, so have some of these occupations expanded by a similar factor? And the answer generally is no. The number of school teachers has increased by about a factor of 3. The number of managers and administrators has expanded by about a factor of 3. The number of physicians has expanded by somewhere around a factor of between 3 and 4. Number of lawyers has expanded by about a factor of 5. So basically, the supply, for at least for these occupations, the supply has grown more rapidly than demand. Okay. And so part of this is about the story of, okay, you know, okay, the supply has increased more rapidly than the equilibrium quantity. Well, I think this is the equilibrium quantity. So basically, so my argument is, and so one thing that you could say is that there are certain occupations not on this list, like computer programmer, where the demand for that has exploded, and that's not represented here. But so my basic message with this table is that one of the leading stories that you would read about from labor economists over the past 15 years or so is that we're not producing enough college graduates. And when I look at what's going on here, and now granted I'm restricting to more experienced college graduates, but we've had quite significant growth in the number of college-educated workers over 40. And if we look at what the majority of college-educated workers were doing in 1968 and look at the growth in those occupations, we got a lot of college-educated workers left over once we account for all these changes. And so it makes me think that, all right, there's a little bit more to this story. So, you know, some labor economists would tell the story that the rise in inequality is about, okay, that the college wage premium has gone up because we're not producing enough college graduates. And we seem to be like, if you just look at the number of college graduates we're producing, and then we're looking at something like, you know, the case of physicians is great, because, you know, the number of physicians that we have trained in the United States is restricted by the American Medical Association, right? So they are intentionally preserving their own wage premium by imposing institutional structures that ensure that they don't face as much competition. Okay. So the physicians get to benefit from this. The secretaries don't. The restaurant wait staff don't. And so that ends up being part of my story as well. What I want to make sure to show you, and at this point I'm kind of down to like a couple minutes, and my clicker seems to be not clicking so much anymore. Oh, maybe I need to actually, here, let's try this. There we go. I have some regressions. So summary statistics, I'm going to be looking at the current population survey from about the mid-1960s to 2022. And the variable, whoops, before we get to the regression results, the variable that I'm really going to be looking at is what is the working age share of the population. And I'm going to look at how that influences measures of income. And of particular interest is not so much how does this influence average income, but how does it influence measures of inequality. And I'm also going to look at a measure of labor force attachment in addition to income, because labor force attachment has been trending over time, and so you might be somewhat concerned that, you know, for most of my analysis, I'm going to be looking at log earnings, which means if you don't work, you're not in the analysis, and so we need to have some consideration of that. Okay, so the first table of results, when I look at what is the effect of the working age share on just average earnings, the answer is it really depends on what kind of time trend you control for. If you have no time trend or a linear time trend, you get a negative coefficient. If you go to the quadratic, it turns positive and significant. So my message to you is forget about all that. That's not really why we're here anyway. We're here to talk about inequality. And so here's the story that's more consistent over time. Let's look at this interaction between working age share and low education level, high school or less. So whether we have no time trend at all, going to linear, quadratic, or a fully flexible year fixed effects model, we get these negative significant coefficients across the board, which indicate that, yes, indeed, as the share of the population that is of working age goes up relative to time trend, the spread between less educated workers and more educated workers rises. So inequality increases, okay? Let me also show you real quick. So this is just showing you, all right, labor force attachment is kind of trending downwards, particularly for males of working age over time. I'm going to show you that labor force attachment also, okay, again, like there's some effects here when we're just looking overall at the effective working age share, but I'm interested in inequality, so this is the most important row. And again, we get negative significant coefficients across the board, regardless of what kind of time trend we use, sort of showing that, okay, the gap in labor force attachment between more and less educated workers widens as the working age share of the population increases. Last set of results to show you, I can also do this analysis not looking at pure time series variation, but looking at sort of state by year variation, because different states have different demographic trends. And the second row here is where we consider inequality. And yes, once again, whether we're looking at a measure of earnings or whether we're looking at a measure of labor force attachment, we see that as the working age share rises, inequality widens. So like, okay, so this is like, so where do we go from here? This dependency ratio, which is kind of like the inverse of the variable that I'm kind of most focused on, we see that that hit a minimum in 2010. And not only has it been increasing for the past 10 years, but it's going to continue increasing to the point where we get back in 2060, we'll be back somewhere around the levels that we last saw in 1970. Well, okay. So, and I'm finishing up right at the right time before it gets too loud to hear in here. So this just summarizes what I told you. So I won't take any more time to walk you through what I just told you, but we still have some time left for questions if. Yeah.
When you think like not all college degrees are created equal, and there's a big role of hyper-selective colleges and universities versus the selective in kind of your professional outcomes. How are you thinking about the role of college education overall with these findings in mind, and how are you thinking specifically about the divide between hyper-selective institutions versus less selective?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. I mean, so hyper-selective is a kind of a really small, like if you look at what % of college graduates overall went to one of these, elite private, particularly private institutions, that's a small share, and it's decreasing over time. So going back to if you go back all the way to the 1940s to back in the data from the late 40s, private colleges produced half, or had half of all post-secondary enrollment. And now it's somewhere maybe around a quarter. So I think that going to one of these elite institutions is maybe very beneficial for going into some of these high-paying occupations. It's sort of like, it's how you get your, and like, I have grad school era friends who went into investment banking. And so I got to hang out with some investment bankers in London one time. And they were talking about the importance of going to a place like Penn or to a place like Harvard. And it's all about, well, these are the colleges where the investment banks recruit. And so for them, the value of a degree from a place like this was not about what you learn. It's about where are the recruiters interviewing. So it's purely signaling. And so that's potentially part of the story of, like, when we think about the occupations that impose barriers to sort of make sure that the occupation doesn't get so big that their wages go down. This is potentially one of the factors in that kind of story. And how do medical schools decide where to recruit students from? I mean, in the more recent data, you know, with more emphasis on diversity and inclusion and all that, these patterns may be changing. But I think the elite colleges have historically played this role of, okay, to the extent that we're going to restrict access to opportunity, this is one of the factors, or this is one of the institutions that play a role in that restriction. And I think, you know, the institutions have done a lot of soul searching about that, and the employers are also doing soul searching and changing their patterns. And so, you know, that may change over time. But if we continue, you know, if we continue to have sort of a world where there's only so many slots in medical schools, but the medical schools want to be more active about recruiting students who went to HBCUs and who went to less selective public universities, okay, that's great. They'll diversify their student body, but it's still going to be a small student body.
Thank you for your presentation. I think I'm having a hard time understanding the role of gender in the story that you told, particularly how you're defining the share of the population that's working age, and whether women are in that numerator in all years.
Yes.
Since they have varying, particularly married mothers, as you pointed out, have varying levels of labor force participation across this period. I'm also trying to understand the impact of their labor force entry on maybe the younger workers or less educated workers you were talking about, given occupational sex segregation and so on. What's your sort of general take on that?
Yeah, so let me go way back to So in the period of time between so this graph, for example, is there's no gender restriction in this graph. So when I talk about percent working age in the population, there's no gender restriction on that either. When we talk about the increase, so basically there's three sources of increase in labor supply over the 1970s and 1980s. One of them is that we have the baby boom cohort, which is a larger cohort than the one they replaced. We have growing immigration because immigration restrictions were relaxed in 1965, and we have increasing women's labor force participation. So those three things are all kind of happening around the same point in time, and it is coinciding with this rise in inequality. And so I think so the entry of women into the workforce in greater numbers, I think, is part of the story that I would tell for why it's part of the supply side explanation for trends in inequality. Now, I mean, if you look in the more recent data, you know, I think that in the Great Recession, starting with the Great Recession, you start to see this conversation about, okay, it's now the job prospects for men that are more threatened. And it's in many cases the labor force participation of men that looks like it's lagging relative to women. But labor force participation for women has kind of hit a plateau, and it's fluctuated somewhat since I think about the 90s or so. And so when we look at the projections going forward about, well, what's going to happen in the future, women's labor force participation is not as much of a part of that. I mean, I don't see a big trend there. It seems like it's been fairly stable. And so it would be reasonable to say we should not, because the increase in women's labor force participation was part of the story here, that we wouldn't really expect a complete reversal of what we saw here going forward to 2060, because there's no reason to think that women's labor force participation is going to go back down. So I think that's important. Janice?
Yeah, okay. Thinking about labor economics sort of being divided into two camps. The people that are talking about, oh, it's all about technology and human capital and international trade, and the people that are more about power and structure and labor market. You're clearly in the power and structure side, I think. So this would come down on the policy side, thinking more towards unionization and minimum wage as correcting inequality than these other guys, right? Is that where you're thinking public policy wise?
there's clearly more of an institution story here. I mean, I would sort of paint myself as being like neither fish nor fowl. You know, that the supply story is just another set of factors. There's a tripartite division. That's just that one of the three parts kind of disappeared from the conversation for 30 years. However, clearly in the story that I'm telling, there is a role for labor market institutions, because while unions have been declining in sort of the blue collar workforce, we've had other segments of the workforce where they figured out how to similarly impose structure on labor markets for the benefit of the workers. I think one of the things that strikes me, because we're starting to see more stories of unionization in sort of the service sector, we had strikes in the auto industry this year. We're seeing increased pressure to increase the minimum wage. I just talked with a legislator in Washington, which now has, I think, the highest state minimum wage in the country. In 25, they're going to try to raise it even more. And I think that one of the things that happens is that as workers become scarce, their bargaining power increases. And so part of what I think about with institutions is that institutions themselves may be influenced by the degree of bargaining power. And so in the 1970s and 1980s, as we start to have an increase, I mean, there's a variety of factors. There's demand side factors. So now employers are looking to expand their operations abroad. But also there's this plenitude of workers in the United States. And so it puts labor in a relatively weak position. And this is a period of time where we see declines in unionization, declines in the real value of the minimum wage. And so now that workers, so, you know, I sort of, sometimes when I describe what this paper is about, this paper is about a transition from an era of plentiful labor to an era of scarce labor. And I think that as we make this transition, there will be more opportunities for labor to take advantage of their scarcity. And we'll see more things like Starbucks unionizing, and we'll see more, and we'll see more workers willing to strike, because they're in a better position now, because there's not so many cheap places to offshore your manufacturing anymore. And the size of the workforce in China and some of these other countries, China is having a bigger demographic problem than we are these days.
So, raised a lot of very interesting points. One of the things I think you're assuming going forward is that immigration is going to be restricted. That'll be true. But behind that, I think, is the assumption that if there were lots more immigrants, that this story would be different. That there would be more the population composition, the labor shortage would be different. So again, huge debate about the role of immigrants in labor market structure and so on. I just wanted to see what your thoughts are on connecting what you're doing here to that.
There's more than one way of expanding immigration. So in the United States historically, and especially compared to other sort of high-income countries, we've had an emphasis in our immigration policy on family reunification. Okay, so family reunification often means, you know, bringing in your elderly parents, or it means, bringing in children and making sure there's space for children. So, and my story is about, okay, what share of the population is working age? So if we were to have a liberalization of immigration policy that continued to emphasize family reunification, it might not move the needle very much on the percent of the population that's available for work. If we went in the direction of some other higher income countries, places like Canada, places that are more openly saying, okay, the main objective of our immigration policy is to address labor shortages in our workforce, then yes, we could very well see an immigration policy that ameliorated some of this going forward. There will be a question of where do we imagine these immigrants coming from? Because, you know, if you sort of like, we are seeing a lot of headlines about what's going on at the Mexican border these days. And we've seen these stories quite often since over decades, right? If you go back to the 1990s and the 2000s, these stories were about immigrants from Mexico coming over the border. If you go back maybe 10 years, it was stories about Central Americans coming over the border. And now it's a story of Venezuelans and people from Haiti and people who are coming from greater distances coming over the border. And you could ask the question, well, okay, well, what about people in Mexico? And the rates of immigration from Mexico have declined. And part of that has to do with demographic changes in Mexico. So Mexico is, like most of Latin America, is a country where the birth rates have declined more rapidly than they have in the United States. And there's been economic growth. Part of it is probably related to NAFTA and other trade policies, but economic opportunities have improved in a country like Mexico to an extent that, okay, you know, the number of people that are looking to leave is smaller than it once was. So I think, so some of the, like, as the next few decades play out, we have high-income countries across the world that are facing similar problems with labor shortages. And so all these countries are going to have an incentive to try to fix some of their labor shortages with immigration policy. They just have to figure out where the immigrants will come from, because the countries that have historically been sources of immigration for the high-income world are themselves experiencing demographic change, they're experiencing economic change. And so the number of people that are sort of available and willing to move may also be declining. So how will the United States fare in relation to some of these other countries that have historically had more favorable policies than the United States? The political environment in the United States is a big question going forward, that sort of thing. So maybe we could adopt a very liberal immigration policy that really helps us to, you know, if the story that I'm telling is really true, if we try to bring in an immigrant workforce, that's going to be bad for workers here, which is a part of the anti-immigration rhetoric as well. So yeah, so that is one variable that could influence what happens, but you know, I don't have a firm prediction on what we'll actually see.
Okay, we run out of time. Okay, thank you, Jim.
Great, thank you.